Okay, let's dive in here, chapter 10, sales contracts and practices. So there's kind of two phases to this chapter. There's what we're going to cover that's in the text, but then we largely go to the form itself. And most of the work we do in this chapter is going to be from the form itself. Before I even get into the chapter, let's talk about the form. Is there really any such thing as the form? No. Who drafts contracts in this state? Attorneys do, right? There's no magic attorney who the Real Estate Commission says is the only attorney who can draft a sales contract. What attorney can draft a sales contract? Any attorneys. This form, the one that we're going to go over in this chapter, why have we chosen this particular one if there's no, this is the form? Jointly approved by who?
The bar and the Association of Real Estate.
Yeah, but is either one of them the Real Estate Commission?
No, but they don't.
Well, you know, McDonald's is a legal entity. They don't approve of it.
Well,
Why do you think it is that we use this form in this class? I'm sorry?
Simple. It helps us out, makes it simple. It's something
It
to go
helps it
by.
out, makes it simple. Yeah, you haven't hit on the big one yet, though.
It's approved by the.
Say it again. It's the most universal, is what Phoebe said. It's the most used one. It's the one that 99% of the time is what you're going to find in the real world. Because it is jointly approved by who, James?
North Carolina Bar Association and North Carolina Association of Real Estate.
The North Carolina Bar Association, and that big one at the end, the North Carolina Association of Realtors. And if you are selling residential real estate, where are you most likely finding and marketing that residential real estate? In the MLS. And who owns the MLS? Who? The Association of Realtors. So do you have to be a member of the Association of Realtors in order to access that MLS?
Yeah.
So is it fair to say that if you're selling residential property, it's very likely that you are a realtor? And do you think it's very likely that if you are a realtor, you're going to use the form that is provided for you by the Association of Realtors? That's why we teach you this form. It's not because the Real Estate Commission prefers it. It's not because it's the form that has to be used. It's not for any of those reasons. We teach you this form because it's the most likely one that you're going to see. They test you about it because the honest likelihood is that if you work in residential real estate, this is the form you're going to see on a daily basis. Okay? But I need you to understand that just because it's the only one we teach you specifically, it's not the only one that can be used. Can you use any contract that's been drafted by an attorney in North Carolina? Yeah. So can you go on LegalZoom and get a contract that's a fill-in-the-blank contract and have it be legal in the state of North Carolina? Yeah. Yeah. As long as it's a North Carolina attorney who does it, and they do it subject to all the rules of the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. The thing you know about these forms is, because they are done by the North Carolina Bar Association and the North Carolina Association of Realtors, they do comply with all the rules of the state and all the rules of the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. They work in conjunction with the commission to make sure they've created a contract that the commission says passes muster. Does that make sense for you guys? So you have some level of relief, some level of certainty when you use these forms, because you know they've already been graced by everybody who might potentially have a problem with the contract that you use. We good with that? Yeah. But remember, it's not the only one. It's not the only one. All right. Yes, ma'am.
I only have page 5 through 13.
You only have page 5 through 13. Well, why do you need the first 4 pages? I don't understand why that would be. Some people are so attorneys, man. Wow. They cannot get away with anything with them. So, let's talk about some of the rules about the sales contract. And now we're back out of the form. We're not in the specifics of that form, we're in the generics of sales contracts, period, and how we create them. The sales contract itself is going to set forth all the promises between the buyer and the seller for the purchase of that property. That's the purpose of the sales contract. All the details, all the promises. What is the buyer promising to do? What is the seller promising to do? By what date? Is there a timeline associated with these things? All of that should be identified in the sales contract. Obviously, we know that you are not going to be drafting these agreements. Now, there's a big difference between drafting contract language and filling in the blanks on a pre-printed form. You're entirely within your lane, so to speak, stay in your lane, if you are filling in the blanks on a pre-printed form. That it's expected that you will do that. Okay? We call it the offer to purchase and contract. That's not one long name, it's two names. When it is signed by one party, it is a what? Offer to purchase. When it is signed by both parties, it is a contract. It is first an offer to purchase, and then it is a contract. It's not one long name, it's two forms in one. And this one that we teach you is jointly approved by the Bar Association and the Association of Realtors. It only can be used by realtors, cannot be used by non-members. Okay? It can be called a lot of different things. If you're on the national section of the exam, sometimes I just call it a sales contract, a purchase contract. On our exam in the North Carolina section, they will always refer to it as the offer to purchasing contract. Okay? There's rules that the Real Estate Commission has about things that have to show up in the contract. There's about 19 of them, and you don't have to memorize all of them. But you do have to memorize the two things that can never be in there, and we talked about these last week. We talked about it when we talked about agency agreements. We said this is where we talk about these things and not in the sales contract. What are the two things that we cannot put in a sales contract in North Carolina? Commissions and what else? A liability statement. In other words, you can't put a statement in there that says the brokers will not be held responsible. What is it the attorneys like to say? Brokers will be held harmless and indemnified against any claims whatsoever. No, you can't say that. If you are a broker in this state, you don't get to waive your liability in the sales contract. You're not part of the sales contract. So you can't talk about your commission, you can't have a liability waiver. Okay? It's in your book in Appendix D, but that's a dated version. They update this thing yearly, so what I've given you is the current version of the offer to purchase and contract. Now, sales contracts are covered under the statute of frauds. What does that mean? They must be what? In writing. They must be signed by all parties. And then you need to know this law called the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. This is the most wonderful thing to ever happen to real estate. When I got into this business, prior to the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, we had to have 6 original signature copies of every sales contract. One for the buyer, one for the seller, one for the listing agent, one for the buyer's agent, one for the lender, and one for the attorney. 6. How many pages is that thing? That's a lot of paper, right? Now back then it wasn't 13 pages, it's like front and back of a legal sheet of paper. We were a lot less complex back then. But 6 original signature, and you had to deliver, mail it or take it. Now, what the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act says is that a facsimile of a signature is the same as a signature. Well, facsimiles used to be only fax machines, but what do we have now?
Email.
DocuSign, scanners, copiers, all of those things are fine. Matter of fact, it's very rare now that you have any original signatures on a document. Because if you think about it, we make an offer, we either sign it via DocuSign, or your client signs it, and what's the first thing you do with it?
Email.
You scan it, so you can email it. So then they present it to their client, and they say, okay, we accept, and they sign it, and then what do those people do? They scan and email it back to you. So the copy you're working with has no original signatures, and the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act says that is just fine. Thank goodness. So we don't need original signature copies anymore, because electronic signatures are binding. There is a difference between electronic signatures and digital signatures, but you don't have to know that on the test, so I'm not going to point that out. Basically, an electronic signature is a copy of a written signature, so like a fax or a scan or a copy, whereas a digital signature is a DocuSign. You go in and you click in a box to put your signature. But they all work. Okay? So let's talk about the whole idea of offer and acceptance. Okay? Offer and acceptance. The offeror is going to make the offer. That's the person giving the offer. And that offer is going to the offeree. Now, in the traditional sales transaction, traditional, notice I didn't say it had to be this way. In a traditional sales transaction, who's usually the offeror, the buyer or the seller? The buyer. It's usually a buyer making an offer to a seller. So the seller would be the offeree, right? What about a counteroffer? They reverse roles. They switch roles, because in a counteroffer, isn't the seller now making that offer to the buyer? Now, counteroffers are interesting little animals. First and foremost, you need to know what they represent. What do you think that is? A rejection. Offers, folks, are take it or leave it. Nothing as an instructor annoys me more than when I'm doing a real world transaction. And I know it's just the way people express things, but words have meaning, right? We don't get alternate definitions of these kinds of things. They have a real meaning. And so when we say that our client has accepted a contract, except this one thing, what we've said is a bunch of nonsense. Because you either accept a contract or you what? Or you reject it. Those are your only two options. If you make even one change, even if it's just, oh, well, the closing date was on my birthday, so I adjusted it to the day before, that is a counteroffer. And it constitutes a rejection of their original offer. Now, for real world purposes, that doesn't have much risk, because most of the time the buyers probably want to do, but is there some small risk that maybe they were considering pulling their offer off the table, and if you had just signed it, you would have had them under contract, but you send it back to them and say, oh, well, we're good with everything, but we changed the closing date because it's my birthday. What could they say? We don't want it. Because what you've made them is a counteroffer. And they're going to come out and say, and they're going to come out and say, oh, don't worry about it. The closing date's fine. We can do it on my birthday. That's still just another counteroffer. You don't get to retroactively accept that offer that you rejected already. Once you reject it, it's dead. Does everybody understand that? Now, this word offer is important. Remember, we said it's the offer to purchase, and then it's the contract. Very often, you'll see test questions that are based around this idea of when can you pull an offer off the table? The answer to that question is always. Because if it's an offer, you can pull it off the table. You can't pull a contract off the table. So the only time it gets locked in is when it changes from offer to contract. Good? With that idea? So, an offer should be definite and precise. Advertisement of a property does not constitute an offer. And an offer may have these things called contingencies. How many of you are familiar with that terminology, a contingency? Now, a lot of you may be familiar with a specific type of contingency, but I don't want you to think that's the only contingency. So let me give you my definition of contingency. A contingency is anything where you can put the word if into a contract. If this happens, then I can get out of this contract. If this doesn't happen, then I can get out of this contract. Either one of those is a contingency. Does that make sense for you guys? Now, there's one specific type of contingency that most people run right to when I say that word. It means they have to sell another property before they can move. But what you're essentially saying is, if I don't sell my property, then I don't have to do what? I don't have to buy yours. It's still an if statement. Are there other types of contingencies you could think of that would be in a purchase contract potentially?
Loan approval.
Loan approval. We would call that a finance contingency. If I can't get a loan, then I don't have to buy your property. I can get out of this contract. That would be a finance contingency. Could we have a condition contingency? We're going to inspect the property, and if we find anything wrong with it, you have to fix it, or we can get out of this contract. Somebody trapped in the bathroom?
I give up.
That's not, I feel like that or Tony Orlando's over there knocking 3 times. I don't know. Y'all that are under 35, you don't know what that is.
I know what you said.
Go home and Google it or something. You might find out. Those of you that are older than 35 definitely know what I'm talking about.
I do.
But, Monty's like, I do.
Phoebe,
So-
did you know what it was, honey?
Who? No, Phoebe has no idea. She's no way. No, she has no idea. But with contingencies, it can be anything where you put an if statement in there. As a matter of fact, when I got into this business, we had contingencies for everything in there. There was an appraisal contingency. If the property didn't appraise for the sales price, then the buyer could walk away. There was a repair contingency. The contract actually said this, and you think about how stupid this is. It is a condition of this contract that the following systems, if installed, are performing the function for which originally intended. And there was a paragraph this long that listed everything you could possibly think about that would be in a house. Garbage disposals, HVAC systems, plumbing systems, heating systems. So when you put that in there as a condition or a contingency, what you're really saying is that the only way the buyer is going to be held to that contract is if that house is what?
Perfect.
Perfect. How many of y'all have ever seen a perfect house?
Doesn't exist.
It was the dumbest contract, no contract on the face of the planet. So when I got into the business, if you were smart and you were representing a buyer, you could get them out of a contract at any time. Because there was so many contingencies built into the contract. You know, finance contingency. If I can't get this loan, here's the loan I'm going to get. If I can't get this loan, then you have to let me out of this contract. How hard is it, folks, to pick up the phone and call your lender and say, hey, I need a letter that says you can't give me a loan? How many of you know a lender that's so ethical that they would not, sorry, that they wouldn't give you that letter, especially if you said, well, the reason I want this letter is because I'm getting ready to go buy a house down the street and it's $50,000 more and I'm going to get the loan from you on that one. You'd have the letter before you got off the phone. I'm sorry, we cannot issue Mr. Everett a loan. And then I give that to the seller, and what's the seller got to do? Let me out. It was ridiculous. Contingencies, the whole point of a contingency is it's a door out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, as you'll see when we get into this current version of the offer to purchase and contract, and I will say I'm a little biased because I had some input into this system that we used years ago when we went to this. The idea of the current contract that we use is, let's turn the contract into what it really was, which was the buyer could get out for any reason anyway. So that's what we say now. The buyer can terminate for any reason or no reason whatsoever. They had bad Mexican food and it gave them gas, so I want to terminate the contract. They can do it. Because the language literally says the buyer can terminate for any reason or no reason whatsoever. But we threw a wrinkle in there. We made you pay for that right. We made you pay a non-refundable fee to have that right to walk away. Does that make sense for you guys?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we use now in this version of the offer to purchase and contract. When you ask questions about due diligence and the due diligence period and the due diligence fee, what we're referring to is that period of time that buyers now have under this version of a sales contract to walk away for what reason?
Whatever.
Whatever. But they've done what for that period of time? They've paid for it. And what magic word did I use about what they paid? Non-refundable. Hence the word fee. It is a due diligence fee. Yes?
So since you were privy to that coming about,
Mhm.
was there any discussion about setting what that due diligence fee should be? Because it's gotten a little insane.
Much discussion. And I will tell you that that discussion always fell by the wayside to the advocates of letting the market decide.
Yeah, well, there you go.
That was, is, and has remained a contentious debate among many of us in the profession who have input into such things. But the folks who think that there should be some guidance on those numbers are far outnumbered by the folks who say the market conditions should dictate that. And so what we have seen has been wild swings in the amounts of due diligence fees. We had really terrible timing when we put this contract in. And it's funny to me to watch this evolution. When we went to this contract, it was 2010. 2010 was when we went to the due diligence version of this contract. So it's been 7 years now. I still call it the new contract. It tells you how old I am and how long I've been around. I still call it the new contract when we've been doing it for 7 years. But when we went to this idea, before that, remember we had this contract with all these contingencies in there. It is a condition of this contract that the following systems, if installed, will be performing the function for which intended. That one right there was the killer. That one was the one that got us to this contract. Because what does performing the function for which intended even mean? I'll give you an example. What is the function of a water heater? To heat water. So if I go in and I inspect the house and the thing is rusted and it literally looks like a ticking time bomb, but you go in the house and you turn that spigot on and you got hot water, it is performing the function for which intended. And the buyer, because they had signed a contract, essentially said, if it's broke, fix it. If it's not, I have to take it the way it is. The buyer was locked into buying that house with a ticking time bomb sitting under it, knowing they were going to have to replace it immediately after closing, and they didn't have the right to ask for that to be replaced. So sometimes it worked against the buyer. Sometimes it worked against the seller. Windows. If I never have to deal with another condensated window, the rest of my life, it'll be too soon. What is the intended function of a window? It all depends on what side of the transaction you're on, don't it? If I am the seller, what is the intended function of a window? There ain't a hole in the side of the house. That's the intended function. See right there, there would be a hole. There's glass, it's performing its function. If I'm the buyer, what's the intended function of a window? I better be able to see out of it, I better be able to see in it, I better be able to open it, I better be able to close it. If it's got a tilt sash, it better tilt, and it better do this, and it better do that, and it better stay open when I push it up. If the springs are gone, that's not in. I mean, I got a list 40 pages long of what a window is supposed to do. And that's what we would have. We would get in these contracts when we would do inspections, and we would be out here arguing. I spent 4 hours one day at a house in Chapel Hill with a ladder and a guy from Rice's class, and we went up and down that ladder all day long, and we had debates about whether this window was performing its intended function. 4 hours. Because I was on the seller side and the buyer was being obstinate about it, and the whole argument was, you know, what is the intended function of this window, and which ones have to be replaced, and which ones don't have to be replaced. So this is these kinds of disputes got us to this idea of a due diligence contract. Well, the timing could not have been more terrible. 2009, 2010 was the absolute bottom of the market. What do you think a due diligence fee? Now remember, you're paying a non-refundable fee, and the only thing you're paying for is time to be able to walk away. What did the market look like in 2009, 2010? Terrible. For every house or for every buyer looking, there were 30 houses for sale, right? What kind of due diligence fees do you think those buyers had to pay to get under contract?
None.
0. $50, $100 for a month. We're gonna negotiate for a month of due diligence time, and we're gonna pay you $50. Well, the sellers were so desperate to get a contract, they would take that. And man, listing agents, they blistered us that had anything to do with that form. This is the dumbest thing from the seller's perspective I've ever seen in my life. I got people who are sitting there and they, take their house off the market for a month and all of a sudden that buyer walks away and all we get is $50. Well, of course, our response was, well, why did you negotiate for $50? But they felt they had to based on market conditions, right? Who do you think now thinks a due diligence contract is a terrible idea?
Buyers.
Buyers do. Because now that same house that had a $50 due diligence fee in 2009, 2010 has a $5,000 due diligence fee now. And now the sellers have all the leverage, because if I've paid a $5,000 due diligence fee, now remember, I have the right to walk away for any reason or no reason. Tell you folks, it'd have to be a hell of a big reason at that point in time, wouldn't it? I mean, if I inspect the house and I find out the HVAC system is shot, completely shot, I mean, it's reasonable for me to say, Mr. Seller, you need to fix that. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
And what do you think is reasonable for the seller to respond to me?
No, thank you.
No. You want it like it is today. Because they got my $5,000 no matter what, right? And how much is the HVAC system going to cost? $5,000, right? So the worst case scenario for them is they use my $5,000 to put a new HVAC system, put it back on the market, mark the price up by $5,000, and say brand new HVAC system. They can't lose. So that's that's a very long answer to your question, but no, there's no limit on it, and it has gotten out of control. I mean, it has honestly gone crazy. I closed a transaction this past year on the listing side. And I honestly, when I saw the offer, the first thing that came out of my mouth was, talking about the buyer's agent, was, what on earth is she smoking? $20,000 due diligence fee. $20,000 due diligence fee. Literally, they were paying $20,000 for my client's signature on that piece of paper. When I presented the offer to my clients, this is how your clients don't think. It was an above full price offer with a $20,000. We were listed at $390. It was $410 with a $20,000 due diligence fee. We had an offer for $415 with a $2,500 due diligence fee. And they said, well, why do you think we should take the $410 when we got $415? I said, $20,000 that you're going to get in a cashier's check tomorrow. This one is going to close. And you're not going to have to spend $1 for it to close. Because there is nothing conceivable that they could find on an inspection that could cause them to run away. And if they did, we would have the biggest party you've ever seen, because you got $20,000 and you can still sell the house. Right? But they were so caught up on the difference between $410 and $415. No. Of course, it closed, and so that worked out fine for that buyer's agent. But what was funny is he sent me a repair request. And I said, Wayne, bless your heart. No. He said, well, what, no to what items? All of them. This list? No. We're not. You're not going to fix anything? No, we're not.
Okay, but as a practical matter, and I understand completely why you took that position, because why not? But wouldn't you want to perhaps encourage your sellers to still do even some token repairs just to keep the relationship somewhat?
In that case, no.
No. They're not going to walk.
They're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
They're not going anywhere. And quite honestly, none of them were safety issues. None of this. I mean, it was small, doors sticking. It was run-of-the-mill stuff, Because my approach to that is, okay, what things would we have to disclose if we put it back on the market, and what would be the cost of having to fix those? And if the due diligence fee dwarfs that number, then we really just have a very strong negotiating position there, you know, which is to say there isn't a negotiating position, it's take it or leave it, you know. But they, again, they put themselves in that situation, and hopefully, they had that discussion when they made that offer. Because if I had a buyer who wanted to make a $20,000 due diligence fee, I would say, listen, if you do that, number one, I think you're crazy. That's first and foremost. Number two, I understand why you're doing it, and it will likely work. You will get this contract. But don't expect anybody to do anything for you from the time we go under contract. So you better be very comfortable with the condition of the property. You better be very comfortable that it's either going to appraise or that you're willing to pay the difference if it doesn't appraise. Because I'm telling you, once you commit $20,000 to these people, they're not going to help you with anything. See, that's the kind of advice I'd be giving. And sometimes it's the advice we give to our buyers right now because they're in such a competitive market, is to say, you just really don't have much of a negotiating position. And that's uncomfortable, but if you want me to give you advice based on what it takes to get under contract, sometimes that's what it takes to get under contract these days. Yes?
But do you ever have an instance where a buyer will kind of increase their offer or their
Due diligence fee?
the due diligence fees, exactly. So they'll increase the due diligence fee with a contingency that in their offer that a portion of that or percentage of that amount could be refunded back for repairs. Not saying refunded back, but the seller will execute that. So up to, so if I give you $20,000 as a due diligence fee, up to $10,000, you will, you know,
Here's what you're asking me. Can I draft a whole bunch of contract language? What's the answer to that question?
No.
Well,
No.
not you, but can you have that done in the
By whom?
By an attorney. I'm saying.
And so what's the answer? Can an attorney draft a bunch of contract language?
Yes.
Yes.
That's, I mean, I have to simplify it like that for you. Because you're asking me a very simple question. Can you do it? No. Can an attorney do it? Absolutely.
But I guess that scenario, offering that to a seller, kind of covering yourself out on the buyer's end of things. So yeah,
So you're covering yourself in a situation that's designed for you to be uncovered, though. See, that's the argument. That's what you're asking an attorney to do. You're saying, I want a contingency on top of I can terminate for any reason. Well, any reason pretty much covers them all. Right?
Yeah. I guess.
And so, in practical purposes, you just really need to come up with a due diligence fee that you're comfortable with. If you had to walk away, you'd be willing to walk away from. And keep it in mind, that's not the only money you'd be walking away from. Because usually, why do you think most buyers would terminate during the due diligence period? Because they found something on what? On an inspection. Or it didn't appraise. They've probably paid for that inspection and that appraisal already during the due diligence period. That's another $1,000 they've committed to this thing. So it's not just the due diligence fee itself, it's the other money that they've committed. So that's a conversation you have to have with the buyer when the seller won't fix something. If it's a $2,000 repair, and my buyer's paid a $1,000 due diligence fee and paid $400 for a home inspection and $500 for an appraisal, I'm going to look at my buyer and say, you've already paid for the repair. And guess what? If we terminate, you can do that, but you got to go buy another house, and you're going to have to spend another $2,000, and there's no guarantee this might not happen again, so you could very well be in a worse situation. So what you have to do is weigh out, do you want to take that chance? You know, because people get very tunnel visioned in things, and it's our job to show them the bigger picture. Don't make a decision for them, but to show them the bigger picture, okay? So is everybody clear on this idea of a contingency? A contingency is any time we put that if statement in a contract. The whole idea of a contract is that we're tying people down, right? If we're saying, if this happens, you can get out, or if this doesn't happen, that's a contingency. All right? Acceptance happens when the offeree, so that's the person getting the offer, signs it without making any changes. When the offeree, the person getting the offer, signs it without making any changes, we're not under contract. Acceptance doesn't equal contract. I introduced this idea last week. What did I say? What did I say created a contract?
Communication.
Communication of acceptance. Just because it's signed doesn't mean we're under contract. If we haven't communicated that out back to the other side, we don't have a contract. Any change is a counteroffer, and that represents a rejection. So how can we communicate acceptance? It can be anything. It can be a phone call, it can be in person, it can be by US mail, it can be by email, it can be by fax, smoke signal, whatever. Telegraph, if you can find one. Does the communication of acceptance have to come in the same form as communication of the original offer? So if they hand deliver the offer, do we have to hand deliver our communication of acceptance? No, unless they have specified that the only allowable form of communication is hand delivery, because that becomes part of their contract at that point in time. If their offer says, we will only accept communication via hand delivery, that's what you have to honor. But other than that, it's wide open what method of communication you use.
Why would you do that?
Why would I do that? I never have, so I'd struggle with why you would specify a certain form of communication. Now, I can assume that if you wanted, for example, original signature documents, you would need to specify that. HUD properties that are owned by the federal government, they require original signature documents. They will not honor electronic signatures, so they specify that in the contract. So that's an example.
I had a 30-minute conversation with a lady this week in Santa Fe, New Mexico, about a listing contract. She said, you have to mail it to me. I can't go online and sign it. It's not my signature.
Yes, they can.
She wouldn't do it.
Yeah,
She
yeah,
refused.
they can. I mean, of course, if they want paper, we have to send them paper.
Yeah.
But it's certainly legal, at least in this state. Now let's talk about the mailbox rule, because this you're going to see a test question about. You're going to see test questions about the mailbox rule, and you're going to misunderstand it if you don't listen very carefully to it. Okay? So first of all, when we talk about the mailbox rule, it only applies when we're communicating acceptance. This does not apply when we're communicating an offer. Everybody got that?
Yes.
The mailbox rule is not in effect until we're talking about communicating acceptance. So which party is placing something in the mailbox? Offer or offer E?
Offer.
Offer who? E. Offer E. The second party has signed the thing and they're putting it in the mailbox. Is everybody with me on the scenario so far?
That can vary.
So the second party, the offeree, has signed it. That's acceptance, right? Now, the method of communication they have chosen is the blue box. The United States Postal Service. Or any mail service. FedEx, UPS still fall under the mailbox rule. Let me give you the history of the mailbox rule so maybe you can understand why it works the way it works. Remember when we talked about the government rectangular survey? And how it was created by Abraham Lincoln at a point in time when we needed a way to describe property that nobody had even seen yet, right? That property existed only in our imagination, it hadn't been explored, it hadn't been mapped, but we could describe it on a map because every square was the same size on that map, right? Well, when they started to sell that property, at that point in time, the only real methods of communication were mostly the mail system. And the mail system at that point in time was like Pony Express. Things took a long time to move back and forth. Well, if you were advertising a piece of land for sale in Montana, and you were probably advertising it in a newspaper in Chicago or New York or Boston, right? And the person who was purchasing that property from you would send their acceptance of that offer through what? The mail. Well, because things took so long, what if the seller of that property gets 4 acceptances, 4 people who have said, yeah, I want to buy your piece of property, here's the contract. We needed some legal way to determine who was first. Does that make sense for you guys? How do you determine who's first getting something mailed? A postmark. That's the mailbox rule. So what we actually say with communication when it happens through the mail is that the acceptance is not communicated when we open the envelope. The acceptance is communicated when it's postmarked. So it's gonna be the postmark that determines the time of contract. So if I'm using the mail, I'll give you a today scenario. So let's get out of the 1800s for a second and give you a today scenario. Let's say that I am selling my property in Wrightsville Beach, and I get the offer in, and I'm on my way down there to pack up my stuff because I decided I'm going to sell the house, and the offer comes in, and it's an offer I want to accept. I look it over, I sign it, and on my way down to Wrightsville Beach, I drive by a blue mailbox out in front of Oak Park Shopping Center, and I drop that signed contract in the mail back to the buyer. Now, would that be communication of acceptance?
Not yet.
Communication from seller to buyer. Is that communication of acceptance?
Not yet.
No, post office.
Don't try to get ahead of me. Is communication of acceptance from the buyer to the seller communication of acceptance? If the seller has signed, the offeree has signed, and they communicate that signature to the buyer, do we have a contract?
Yes.
Answer that very simple question for yourself first. Is that a contract?
Yes.
Yes. Here's what the mailbox rule says. It is communicated from the moment it goes into possession of the Postal Service, which is when I do what?
Big mailbox.
Put it in a blue box. That's when that contract is formed. Now, if we got into a practical argument about it, I can't really prove the time it went in the blue box, so what would they again fall back to?
Postmark.
The postmark. They would fall back to the postmark. But here's the key thing about that. It's going to be days before that buyer sees that contract back, right?
Yep.
What if they call me in the interim time period? What if they call me the next day and say, look, we've changed our mind, our offer's off the table?
You've already put it in the mailbox.
It's a contract. They can't rescind an offer because there no longer is an offer. There's a contract. That's the mailbox rule. Yes, ma'am.
Not saying you would do this blue box nowadays, but what happens if you today signed through DocuSign, and then they stuck that in the mailbox and it was postmarked for the day before and you didn't know it, and then you get it in after you've already accepted with this DocuSign person, then you have to renege
So a different
on them.
buyer.
Yeah, you have to renege on them. You have to be like, oh, you gotta call them up and say, well, we got this postmarked.
That's exactly what you have to do. You have to call that second buyer and say, you know, I am so sorry. I did not realize I was already under contract, because this is the law. If the mailbox rule exists as law, now they're gonna be upset. I'm not saying it's gonna be fun or easy, but you don't have any choice. Now, what I would do in that case is I would certainly say to any offeror that was coming in, hey, I do have a counter offer outstanding with somebody else, so you should be aware of that. So at least they wouldn't be completely caught off guard if I said, hey, that one came back first. Now, for practical purposes, the mailbox, at least in this form, is not a good way to communicate acceptance for obvious reasons. There's a big time lapse there. But do you understand the rule?
Yes.
Okay, has everybody got the rule?
Yes.
It is communication of acceptance from the moment it is placed in the possession of the Postal Service. It's a felony to reach in that box and get anything out.
Yep.
I can't know the difference.
That's the perfect question. Because notice I said the blue box version of mail is not a practical application now. Is there a type of mail that is a practical application now?
Email.
Email. The same rule applies. When it's out of my possession, it is communicated. So if I am the offeree, because remember, communication of acceptance can only happen from the offeree to the offeror, right? When the offeree signs, and they communicate that signing back to the other side via email, when is the contract formed? When the email is read, or when the email is sent? When it's sent. When it's sent. That's how we apply the mailbox rule with digital communications. Yes, ma'am.
It's a ridiculous question because I know the answer, but I want to make sure.
Yep.
As an agent, you inform the offeror that it's accepted. You're just waiting on your client's signature. And that is not.
That is not a contract, and you really, so here's Sarah's question. As an agent, I'm informing the offeror, hey, your offer's been accepted, but we're waiting for the signatures. See, I shouldn't use that terminology, because we define acceptance as what? The signature of the offeree.
And I hear agents say that
All the time. It is much misused terminology, and it creates a lot of confusion. What you should say in that is, they're agreeable to your terms, we're waiting for them to accept. They have to sign off before we have a contract, because you've given a more full, clear picture of where it stands, right? You don't want to give your client, the offer, or the impression that they're under contract when they really are not yet under contract. Because that happens, especially in a seller's market like we have right now. When you have a market like we have right now, other offers are going to come in.
Oh, yeah, no, my real estate agent kept telling me that it was accepted and they were just waiting on the signatures. I'm like, that's not accepted.
That's not accepted, that's exactly right. That's exactly right, because they could change their mind and sign and accept something else. Up until the moment they've actually signed it and communicated that signing over you, then you have a binding contract. And so I actually will, the teacher in me comes out a lot when I do transactions. In fact, it came out to me today on a phone call. I had a broker in charge call because she was mad about something one of my agents had done. And it was wrong. There's no doubt about it. And I'll tell you exactly what the situation was. And this is just how my brain works. Due diligence fee has not been delivered. Contract was accepted. Signatures communicated. Do we have a contract? Yes. Contract says the due diligence fee is due at the time of contract acceptance. Now, contract was accepted on Sunday. They don't have the due diligence fee today. Is the buyer in breach of the terms of that contract? Yes. No question. And we represent the buyer. And I apologized to her. I said, I will certainly find out what's going on, why it's not there, what the deal is with it. I said, what is the address so I can pull it up on the MLS so at least I know what property I'm talking about when I call my agent? I pull it up. I look at the top and it says active. It doesn't say pending. It says active. Now I still got her on the phone. I said, Lisa, why does it say active in the MLS? Well, I put it back active today. I said, so let me ask you a question. Why do you think my client owes your client a due diligence fee? What do you think her answer was? She walked her right into it. What do you think she said? Because we got a contract. Ain't that interesting? Because this thing right here that you're advertising to the world says you don't have a contract. And you know what I did to her? I apologize. I said, listen, I apologize, but here's the real estate commission teacher coming out in me. He done wrong. You done wrong. I'm going to make sure he gets right. I suggest you get right too. Because this is a misrepresentation. It's a willful misrepresentation, right? Does she know that that's a lie?
Yeah.
Absolutely. She just told me, because we have a contract. That was her first answer. Absolutely. So you see, contracts are funny things. Everybody's made a bunch of promises, right? And just because somebody breaks a promise doesn't mean the whole thing goes away automatically. That contract specifies what happens in that instance, and what it says should happen is the seller has to give written notice to the buyer, hey, you haven't paid me. And then the buyer has 24 hours to make good on that promise. Well, guess what? She never sent written notice. She's calling us and she's yelling and she's mad and she's marketing the MLS, but she hasn't done the one thing that the contract says she's supposed to do. So these terminologies, they matter. So when we say things like, we've accepted your offer, what we're actually saying is, it has been signed, right? Because the definition of acceptance is a signature. So don't use that terminology unless that's what you really mean, okay? If an acceptance is placed in any mail service to the other party or the other party's agent, now that's an important idea. Communication acceptance doesn't have to happen from the buyer directly to the seller. Remember with our little chart we made on the board last week where I put the buyer on one side and the seller on the other, and I started labeling, here's the buyer's firm, here's the buyer's agent, here's the seller's firm, here's the seller's agent. Communication of acceptance is any communication that goes from one side of the transaction to the other. Now the key to answering these test questions is making sure you get everybody on the correct side. because this is where all those terminologies about agency are going to come in. Travis is working with James as a seller subagent on his purchase of the property at 123 Main Street in Garner. James has formatted a standard offer to purchase and contract form provided by the North Carolina Bar Association and North Carolina Association of Realtors, and Travis has forwarded that offer to the seller for their consideration. The seller signs James' offer without making any changes and forwards the signed contract back to Travis. At what point in time do we have a valid and binding legal contract? What's your answer? What was the first thing out of my mouth? Travis is functioning as a what? Seller subagent working with James, who is purchasing the home at 123 Main Street in Garner. What is James? Is he the buyer or is he the seller? He's the buyer. And Travis is working with him as what? No, as a seller subagent. So whose team is Travis on? The seller's team. So is the seller signing that contract and sending it back to Travis communication of acceptance? Have we crossed the boundary between the buyer and the seller? No. It's the same thing as the seller giving it to themselves. Communication would, in that case, would have to go to James himself because James has no representation. Would the answer to that question be different if I said Travis was an exclusive buyer's agent of James? Would the answer be different? At that point, it would be when it was communicated back to Travis. Do you see the difference between those? So that's where the terminology on the test is going to really matter. When you get these questions about when is a binding contract formed, that's why it's so important to make a buyer side and make a seller side and start labeling as you go through. If you see subagent of the seller, he ain't on the buyer side, he's on the seller's team, right? Because they may even make it more complex. They may say, Travis is working with James as a subagent of the seller. He presents the offer to listing agent Sarah. Well, they made it sound like there's one on each side, right? But in reality, Travis is on the same team as Sarah. And they're both on the seller side. So if Sarah sends it to Travis, is that communication of acceptance? If the seller sends it to Travis, is that communication of acceptance? No, it's got to go across that divide between the buyer and the seller. Y'all with me on that? That's this idea of communication of acceptance. It's exceedingly important. So let's talk about this 2-T form. Pull that thing out, the form. Be careful with my terminology. Watch y'all. Carried away sometimes. So the offer to purchase and contract. And you will sometimes see this referred to as the 2T form. If you look in the bottom right corner, that's just the number of it. The Association of Realtors has a form number for every form, and 2-T is the number for this form. Now, let's talk about the kinds of property, and this is on the test, the kinds of property that this form is used for, and the kinds of property this form is not used for. It's the first thing. You should know when it's appropriate to use this form and when it's not appropriate to use this form. Is everybody with me so far?
Yes.
This form is appropriate in all residential resale transactions. I'll repeat that. This form is appropriate whenever you have a residential resale transaction. What kinds of transactions does that eliminate? In other words, this form is not appropriate for. New construction. Here's why. We'll show you the magic of contract language. Had an agent ask me this question this morning. He said, we're doing an as-is sale. Seller ain't going to make no repairs. This is as-is. That's what he told me. What form do I use for that? Turn to page 2. No, I'm sorry, it's on page 4. Page 4 of 13, paragraph C down there. Does everybody see that repair, improvements, negotiations paragraph right there? Y'all see where I am? Buyer acknowledges and understands that unless the parties agree otherwise, this property is being sold in its current condition. So what form do you need for an as-is sale? The one you already be filling out. Oh, that's what it says. See why it's kind of important to read these things before you have your clients fill it out? It says it right there. In its then current condition. But wouldn't that also be a good reason that this is not appropriate for a new construction property? Think about what a new construction property is going to look like at the time you make the offer. I doubt you want it in its then current condition. We kind of want them to finish it, right? You make the offer when it's half done, 2/3 done, they ain't put the back deck on there. You don't want it in its then current condition. We want it not as is. Would y'all agree with that? So that's why this form is not appropriate for new construction. In a new construction contract, you would need promises for improvements to be made, right? You would need to specify, this is the kind of tile that needs to be put in the kitchen, because guess what? There ain't no tile in the kitchen yet. Is everybody with me on that? Why it wouldn't work for that situation. Here's another transaction that's not covered under residential resale. Vacant land. Vacant land, most of this stuff doesn't apply to. Most of what this contract talks about deals with the improvement on the property rather than the land itself. So it just doesn't apply. The vacant land version's like half this length. Makes sense, right? And that word, residential, it's not appropriate for commercial transactions. So any kind of, how about a residential condo? Would you use this? If it's a resale. Townhouse, would you use this? Yeah, if it's a resale. Single family home, if it's a resale. That's what this form is for. There are separate versions of this form available for those other instances. There's a commercial version of this form. There's a vacant land version of this form. There's a new construction version of this form. Everybody follow me on that? All right. So that's the kind of property we want to use it for, residential resale. Obviously, the names of the parties should be identified, the seller and the buyer. Particularly important here is the seller. More important than the buyer. Sometimes you might have a buyer who's not listed here, and it doesn't matter. When would that be? It takes 1 to buy and 2 to sell. When would that be? When is that? What am I referring to? A married couple, right? Sometimes there might be only one purchaser listed, but how many people are purchasing? 2. That's the way it works in this state. But it doesn't work that way on the seller side. How many sellers should be listed here? All of them. If there's 15, there's 15. All of them are listed here. Okay? A description of the property, and you can get that from the property record card, usually on the tax website. The legal description of the property. Probably not a meets and bounds description, most likely a what? Reference to a plat map. And if you look at that, look at the last, in that property section there, which is section C, if you look down at the very bottom of the legal description section, right above purchase price, it says, or it's sort of in the middle above purchase price, it says plat reference, lot number, block or section, subdivision, as shown on the plat book number and page number. Does everybody see that? That's the reference to a recorded plat. And that's where you would put the legal description of this property in there. Purchase price, that's kind of important. How much are we paying for the thing? That's the consideration. Remember, consideration is just a promise of something of value to be exchanged, right? Is it necessary to have earnest money for it to be for the contract to have consideration? No. Is it necessary to have a due diligence fee? No. Purchase price is enough because it's the promise of the exchange of something of value. So you fill that in on that line, that first line in section D there. Earnest money. Now notice earnest money on here, which is on the third line, it says earnest money, what is that word? Deposit. Deposit's an interesting word. Usually when I make a deposit, I hope to do what with it?
Get it back.
Get it back. Deposits are refundable. Look at the line above. What does it say? Due diligence fee. What's the difference between a deposit and a fee?
These are
Fees are non-refundable. That's exactly right. Due diligence fees are non-refundable, while earnest money deposits are refundable. Under certain circumstances, all deposits come with rules about when they're refundable and not refundable, right? But a fee just isn't. It's by definition non-refundable. Yes, ma'am?
So would it be improper verbiage for someone to say a non-refundable pet fee or a pet deposit?
A non-refundable pet deposit, aka a pet fee. That's what you're saying.
Not,
Yeah.
well, that's.
Because the terminology deposit intonates refundable under certain circumstances. If you're telling me it's completely non-refundable under any circumstance, then it's not a pet deposit, it is a pet fee.
So it would be incorrect that their usage of that. or-
The usage of the verbiage is incorrect. Now, does that mean anything in the real world? Who knows? You'd have to ask a judge. And if you're willing to take it to court over that, more power to you.
No.
You know, because they'd be the only ones. And they very well may say, well, you know, it's pretty clear what they meant. Right? You know, there's no reason that just because it's inappropriate that it would be thrown out. It's up to them. But it is an appropriate usage, yes. When you say non-refundable and deposit together, you're simply saying fee. Just use the real verbiage. Okay? All right? Now, notice on the earnest money deposit line, there's several choices you have about how it can be paid and when it can be paid. Y'all see that? It can be paid by personal check, by bank check, by wire transfer, either with this offer or within 5 days after the effective date. Now, what do you think the effective date of the contract is going to be?
Communicated.
When it is communicated. When acceptance is communicated, that's the effective date, which most likely is going to be the date of the last signature, because usually once somebody signs, we go ahead and communicate it right away. But it's the date it's communicated, that's the effective date. So you have two choices here. Now normally for me, I check within 5 days of the effective date because it's kind of hard for me to send a check via DocuSign. And that's usually how I'm sending these offers. If I check with this offer, I'm supposed to theoretically have to check with it. That's tough to do, so I usually check within 5 days. And remember, the other problem with making it with the offer, everything that goes on these lines is negotiable, correct? The earnest money deposit amount is negotiable. Do I really want to have my buyer write out the earnest money check and then we end up negotiating a different amount and they have to void that check and write me another? Why not let's wait until we actually have an agreement on the terms before we start writing checks? So that's just a little piece of advice, but you can do it either way. Notice you can do additional earnest money deposit as well. Now, additional can be in addition to any number. If you get a $100 initial earnest money deposit and $1,000 additional, your total earnest money would be $1,100. Could you also do zero initial and $1,000 additional? Yeah, you can be in addition to zero. So essentially, you can make the earnest money due on any date you want to. If you don't want to do, if you want to go further out than 5 days, you wouldn't make it initial earnest money, you would make it additional earnest money and simply fill in the date on that line. Now, when I fill out the date on that line, what does it have behind that date? No later than blank. What does it say there? time being of the essence. What do you think that phrase means right there? It is a definite date. We ain't playing around. We mean it. Okay? That's what time being of the essence means. Okay? Fill in the rest of those lines. I'm not going to talk about assumption or seller financing right now. We will talk about those later in the finance chapters. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, that time of being of the essence, if they didn't get that additional earnest money to them by that date, could that breach the contract and make it all go away?
That could be considered a breach of the contract, yes.
Okay.
Now, the making it all go away is up to them.
Like, they can just back out and be like, okay, well, you didn't give me the money, so.
They may decide they have the right to do that.
Attorney.
They should get advice from an attorney, yes. We have to be careful in when we tell people, this is what you can do, this is what you should do, you know, because remember, this is contract stuff, this is not real estate stuff, right? You know, we start crossing the line between real estate advice and legal advice. Now, here's one thing I want to point out to you that's really important. Look at that balance line down there at the bottom. Don't you think that's going to be the total of everything above it?
Yes.
Right? It's going to be the purchase price minus all these other things is the balance that you owe. You understand that? Is the due diligence fee included in that totaling up?
No.
Oh, it's not?
It is.
It sure looks like it is to me. So what does that tell you about the due diligence fee? Is it part of the sales price or is it in addition to the sales price?
Part of
It's
it.
part of. It's part of the sales price. So the due diligence fee is non-refundable. But if you actually close, aren't you being credited for it?
Yes.
Yes. It is becoming part of your purchase price. You only lose it if you use it. And what is it that you're using? The right to do what? To walk away. You only lose that fee if you terminate the contract. Basically, think of it this way. You have committed this much money toward the purchase of the house, whether you finish paying for it or not. But if you finish paying for it, yes, indeed, you're going to get credit for that money. Is your earnest money going to be credited toward that purchase price? Absolutely. Absolutely. These are not additional numbers to the purchase price. They are part of. Okay? Everybody good with that?
So now I understand why your example about fixing something simple when you give them $20,000.
Doesn't make sense?
Yeah, you can fix it when you're done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, if you flip over to the next page, the earnest money deposit, it describes what an earnest money deposit is. It also describes where it's going to be held. It says it shall be deposited and held in an escrow account by the escrow agent. Well, who is this magical person called the escrow agent? There's a line for that. You filling in who the escrow agent is. There's no rule about who has to be the escrow agent. Now, I'm going to tell you traditionally who is the most common escrow agent because you may see it on the test. I will tell you that this is rapidly changing, but traditionally the most common escrow agent is the listing firm. Traditionally, the listing firm. The thought process there was, you remember you have to go back to a time when only sellers had representation, right? That we need somebody who's a professional to guard this money, and who better than the person representing the seller to do that? Does that make sense for you guys? So traditionally it is the listing firm who serves as the escrow agent. Can it be the closing attorney? Sure. Can it be the buyer's firm or the selling firm?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Can it be Uncle Joe down the street? Absolutely. As long as Uncle Joe down the street's got a trust or escrow account and he manages it according to the rules of the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, he doesn't have to be a broker. Brokerage is not defined as managing a trust account. Anybody can be the escrow agent. This is a negotiable term too, right? Anywhere you fill in a blank here, this is a negotiation. You may not agree. Now, most of the time, nobody really cares. And here's the reason nobody really cares. Because everybody has to play by the same rules. There is no difference whether it's the listing agent holding it or the buyer's firm holding it. Because ultimately, neither one of them get to decide who gets it. Who do you think decides what happens with an earnest money deposit? Well, so let's say we ain't got that far yet, because a judge can always decide. Whose money is it? Partially. Whose money is it? Partially. Whose money is it? The buyer's. Doesn't that money equally belong to the buyer and the seller? That's the whole point of it being a deposit, right? So who has to agree to have it dispersed to anybody?
Buyer and seller.
The buyer and the seller. So if they don't agree, what do you do with it? You hold it. You hold it. The contract may say explicitly, earnest money shall be forfeited to the seller. I can read. I'm not stupid. You know who that language is there for? A judge. A judge. My job, if I'm the escrow agent, is to wait for somebody to tell me what to do with that money. And here are the only two somebodies I can listen to. The buyer and the seller, if they agree. Notice I said if they what? Agree. And a judge. That's it. Any other dispute, and I hold it. I sit on it. And I wait. I'll wait for one of those two things to happen in general. We'll talk more about the specifics of the trust account rules, but I want you to understand the basics of it right there. Does that make sense for you guys? You don't release money from a trust account without the permission of both parties. Matter of fact, when we terminate, what you're going to learn about this contract is what it goes on to say here about this earnest money deposit. Notice it has that word deposit, so it is what? Refundable. So let's talk about when it's refundable. It says that the earnest money deposit shall be deposited and held in an escrow account with an escrow agent until closing, at which time it will be credited to the buyer. So if you go to closing, it's credited to the buyer, or until this contract is otherwise terminated. In the event this offer is not accepted or a condition of any resulting contract is not satisfied, then the earnest money deposit shall be refunded to the buyer. In the event of breach of this contract by the seller, the earnest money deposit shall be refunded to buyer upon buyer's request, but such return shall not affect any other remedies available. All this language, who is it for? Because it keeps telling us what to do with it. Who's it for?
Judge.
A judge. Because we don't do anything with it unless they what? Agree. We have a form that says notice of buyer's intent to terminate. We have two versions of it. With release of earnest money and without release of earnest money. If the seller signs the with release of earnest money, guess what we're going to do?
Release it.
We're going to release it and refund it to the buyer. If the seller either won't sign either one of them, they don't have to, or they sign the one that says without release of earnest money, what do we do with the earnest money? We hold it. The buyer's screaming at us the whole time, the contract says I'm supposed to get it back. Wake County Courthouse is right downtown. That's what we have to do. That is our obligation when we are the escrow agent. I don't have an escrow account. Do you now understand why I don't have an escrow account?
Yes.
Because I don't want to be in the middle of that. Because if I say, yes, I'm going to hold that deposit, inevitably somebody's going to get in a pissing match over it, and I'm in the middle of that. If I make one simple response, when somebody says, okay, we want you to hold the earnest money, I say, oh, I don't even have a trust account. Do I have to worry about it?
No.
Nay. Guess who does have a trust account? The closing attorney does. Because they got to. They have to. Aren't we sort of paying them for a service already?
Yep.
Don't you have a pretty good idea who your closing attorney is going to be at the time you make an offer anyway? Why not put them on that line? Why not have them hold the earnest money deposit? Easiest thing to do. Yes, sir.
And the closing attorney would be, it would be okay for him to advise that if you better do what you need to do what the contract says, because the judge is going to tell you to do it anyway, and it's going to cost you to get to that judge.
Yes, and that's a great point. Monty made a great point. He said, and the closing attorney would be in a much better position to advise somebody like that seller who won't release the earnest money and say, listen, you do what you want to do, but this buyer's going to sue you and they're going to win, and when they do, you're going to have to pay all these court costs and you're going to have to pay my attorney's fees, because an attorney can say that. because that's legal advice and they're perfectly capable of giving it, right? So they're in a much better position to threaten and coerce that money into being released. And so it works better. It works better. Is everybody good on that?
Yes.
Scan on down to the due diligence fee. It says a negotiated amount, if any, paid by the buyer to the seller of this contract for the buyer's right to conduct due diligence during the due diligence period. It shall be the property of the seller upon the effective date and shall be accredited to buyer at closing. The due diligence fee shall be non-refundable except in the event of a material breach of this contract by the seller. So the only way the due diligence fee is refunded is if the seller actually breaches the contract. Folks, there are very few ways that the seller can breach this contract. The biggest being not close. They can't close. Maybe they have bad title. Maybe they just won't sign the deed. Maybe they get foreclosed on. Any of those things would be considered a seller breach. And in the event of a seller breach, yes, the due diligence fee is completely refundable at that point in time. But that's the only time. Does everybody understand that? Okay? The due diligence period, notice it says time being of the essence. So the due diligence period is the amount of time that you have to do what as the buyer? Say it again. Back out. That's exactly right. So let's talk about what changes on that day. Let's talk about what changes on that day. The earnest money changes on that day. What did we say earnest money was? What's that? What's our R word that we like so much? Earnest money deposits are what? Refundable. When do you think they might be refundable? During what period of time? The due diligence period. When do you think they might not be refundable? After the due diligence period. So here's the way this contract works, folks. You pay a due diligence fee when you go under contract, and that amount of money is non-refundable. What you just bought yourself is a period of time which is negotiated. You're going to fill in the date, how long this is going to be, to walk away and still get what back? Your earnest money. And if you go past that date and you still don't close, guess what? You don't get back anymore. Your earnest money. That's as simple as this contract is. It is just that simple. If you walk away during the due diligence period, you get your earnest money back. If you walk away after the due diligence period, you don't. Yes, ma'am.
I know I've been angered in the past by this. So, in a situation where you have someone, doesn't it encourage bad behavior on the part of the sellers? Like, if they know something is wrong, like something material, and they know it before the due diligence period is up, and one day after, they're like, oh, hey, by the way, you know, there's a drainage problem in my neighbor's yard or whatever.
Yeah, it might well.
I mean, it encourages that kind
It
of
does.
behavior.
It might, yeah. I can't say it wouldn't. I cannot say it would not. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's certainly a consideration. Now, ideally, we would like to make this due diligence period long enough to conduct all of our investigations. The idea here is that we as a buyer are going to be completely comfortable that we're ready to close. Does that make sense for you guys? We're completely comfortable. So what kinds of things would you need to do in that time period to make sure you're completely comfortable?
Inspection.
Home inspection, appraisal,
Inspections.
appraisal.
Appraisal, right? I want to have an appraisal, but if I'm getting a loan, I've got to have the property appraised.
Loan approval, but that probably would not happen.
Get loan approval, ideally, yeah. We want to get loan approval during that time to make sure we are actually going to get this loan. How about a survey? We're going to have a survey done.
Does survey survive the due diligence period though? Even if there's a defect, but if the survey's done accurate? No?
No.
So that's in there too?
In there too. In there too. Would you want to make sure you could get insurance on the property during the due diligence period? Yeah. You want to know everything there is to know. In other words, at the end of this period, you better be ready to go to closing because you just committed your earnest money. In addition to the due diligence period, a fee, in addition to the money you've already spent on inspections and appraisals and all that. So now we could be talking about some serious cash that you've got committed to this thing.
How do we know how long to put?
How do you know how long to put? The answer to that question is the art of being a buyer's agent. You got to talk to all these service providers ahead of time and get on their schedule before you can even make the offer. If you're really doing your job as an agent, see, before I make an offer as a buyer's agent, I've already got an inspection reserved. I do. I go on the inspector's website and I lock down a date. Because what would I do if we negotiated this due diligence period and all of a sudden the inspectors are booked out for 4 weeks and I can't get an inspection done? We're messed up, right? And I've done my client a disservice. So I've communicated with the lender. How much time do you need for loan approval? If we ordered the appraisal tomorrow, what date could you have loan approval? Get the inspection lined up. Talk to the buyer. Do you want a survey? If they want a survey, I'm going to arrange that. I can call it back and cancel it if I need to. You see what I'm saying? Yep. So as a buyer's agent, that's homework to do before you present the offer. And if you're going to err on the side of too long, not too short.
Right.
Now, that's a completely different consideration from the seller's perspective. Now, let me ask you this. If you're on the seller's side of this thing, you really don't feel comfortable that we're going to close until we get outside that due diligence period, right? I've seen listing agents tell their seller that it was okay to have the due diligence end on January 31st and the closing be on February 1st. So it's okay for you to get a call at 4:30 in the afternoon on the 31st that we're not going to really buy your house. Because isn't that what you're saying is okay?
Yes.
Ideally, if you're on the seller side, shouldn't there be enough time between the end of due diligence and the actual closing for all of your actual moving to take place? In other words, you probably shouldn't start packing up and moving stuff until you're outside of this due diligence period. Because only then can you feel relatively comfortable that we're actually going to close, right?
Yep.
So for my rule of thumb, my recommendation for my sellers is you need at least 2 weeks after the due diligence period. And and God, this is the cardinal sin for real estate agents, because they want it to close tomorrow, right? Does that mean it's going to take longer to close? Yes. Does it mean my clients are better protected? Yes. My approach to the due diligence period from the listing side has always been this. Whatever amount of time you need is the amount of time you need. We're going to negotiate a fee that goes along with that amount of time. But the closing date is going to be more our consideration because we need some time after that due diligence period to get things done. Because we're not going to start, even if we agree to repairs, we're not going to start them until after the due diligence date. Because why would we make all these repairs and the buyer terminates and walks away? And we just made repairs for a buyer that's not even going to buy the house. Yep. You see how that would happen?
Yes.
So the consideration is completely different depending on which side of the transaction you're on.
Right.
I saw your name.
Yeah, what if you have a contingency of if my house were to sell?
If you have a contingency of if my house were to sell, that's a really good question. She wants a contingency in there. I don't have to go through with this contract unless my house sells, right? What's the purpose of your contingency? To do what?
Make sure that I don't have two mortgages.
Okay, make sure you don't have two mortgages. But as it relates to this contract, what are you trying to make sure that you can do what? Get out of it, right?
Yeah, but I was wondering, so with that, would you want to make sure that your due diligence period would pass your sale date of your house?
Yes. She just answered her own question. Did y'all hear what she said? She said, wouldn't I want to make sure my due diligence date went past the proposed closing date of my house that I have to sell? Because the point of a contingency is to say, I can get out for this reason, right? What reason can you get out of this contract during that due diligence period?
Any reason.
Any reason. Do I need any contingencies? There is no contingency.
It's just going to cost you
Any reason. It's just going to cost me because the more time I'm asking for,
more.
the more money they're going to want. Because what are they giving up in exchange during that time?
The opportunity to sell.
The opportunity to sell to somebody else. They're taking their house off the market for me for whatever period of time. And if I want a month, that's going to cost me more than 2 weeks. And if I want 2 months, somebody said to me, well, I had somebody one time, they were way far out from being able to close on their house in California. And the agent brought me an offer. She said, well, what's the longest due diligence period you would entertain? I said, probably one that equated to the purchase price. And she said, what do you mean? I said, what I'm telling you is there ain't no magic number there. If your folks are willing to pay for it, my folks are willing to wait. I mean, that $20,000 due diligence fee, would we have done 4 months if they had asked for it? Yes. Yes, because the risk they're taking is, so what, you don't buy my house, I'm 4 months behind. Is that really worth 20 grand? Right? You see what I'm saying there? So the fee is negotiable, as is the time period, and it basically boils down to you need to set the time period as a buyer for whatever contingencies you need to cover. If that's inspection, if that's appraisal, if that's survey, if that is, I gotta sell my condo first. Whatever needs to be covered under that, make the time period long enough to take care of it.
You need to know what, that time is.
You need to know what that time is. You gotta do your homework to find out.
Due diligence period is 4 months. Does that mean that they can't decide to buy it before the 4 months end?
It does. So Ty's question is, well, what if we have a 4-month due diligence period? Does that mean they absolutely can't close earlier than that? And the answer is no. I mean, you know, ultimately, if they were ready to close sooner and the seller was ready to close sooner, then sure, they could go to closing sooner than that. The seller wouldn't be obligated to honor it because they would have agreed to a later closing date. But most of the time, the seller is all for an earlier closing. In most cases, unless they've got some reason to stay in the house or something like that. Is everybody good on that? I'm just kind of starting to understand the dynamics of how this due diligence fee works thing. So what changes on that date? That's the big question. What changes on that due diligence date?
Whether or not the money's refundable.
Your earnest money becomes non-refundable. That's it. That's it. That's all that changes. Here's the truth of the matter, folks. We say that the buyer can back out at any time prior to expiration of the due diligence period. When can the buyer really back out? At any time. Because what's the penalty for backing out after the due diligence period? They lose their earnest money. If they're willing to lose their earnest money, they have the right to walk away at any time. Yeah, they're considered in breach, but the penalty for the breach is earnest money. So honestly, the buyer has the ability, and that's an important thing to point out to your seller. Because sometimes now that the due diligence fees have gotten so high, earnest money gets lost in the shuffle. People sit there and they say, well, earnest money doesn't matter anymore because nobody ever pays earnest money because they're going to terminate during the due diligence period. You better make sure that earnest money is big enough that if you were sitting at the closing table as a seller and the buyer called in and said, we've changed our mind, we're not buying your house, you better make sure that earnest money is big enough to cover you for that unforeseen incident. It's important. It's important.
So what happens to the due diligence fee?
Well, that's you already got that. You already got that. That's in your. Her question was, what happened to the due diligence fee? That's already in my pocket as a seller. As a matter of fact, who is that check going to be made payable to when we go under contract? Directly to the seller, because it is their money, non-refundable. Who's the earnest money going to be made payable to? And escrow agent. Whoever shows up on that line of the contract as the escrow agent, that's who that's going to be made payable to. Okay? I'm going to stop right there for tonight. We have